To people who've lived in a rough neighborhood, what challenges did you face on a day-to-day basis? And what experiences have stayed with you? Lots of stuff that has been mentioned already. I'll add having to walk several blocks to an area where delivery drivers like pizza would meet you because they would not go further into your neighborhood. Same with cabs and Ubers. Knowing who belongs there is a big one. You know who the regular dealers are, etc. If you see a new person around, that raises suspicion because they could be trouble. Keeping the possessions you really cared about locked up, not in car, in home, because break-ins happen. I personally kept my POS car unlocked because I could not afford to replace the broken window. Nothing in it was worth anything, it never has gotten stolen. Before I had a car, getting groceries was hard. Like another person said, grocery stores were not close by, just overpriced ghetto marts, corner stores. Even catching a bus was hard because there was less service in my area than in other parts of the city. Violence was present, but not something that bothered me. Maybe I was used to it. I have had an armed escort home several times when I found myself in the middle of a gang dispute. Each time, a few fellows who knew I lived near called a truce of sorts and would walk me home. Not that I was particularly special, I think they did that to others who happened to be out late too. Right, so gang members would stop the dispute to walk people home? Well, that's actually quite nice, surprisingly enough. Story 2. I didn't live in one of those areas, but I did frequently work in them. So I worked for a government program which provided certain home improvements at no cost to those income qualified. Windows, doors, insulation, roofs. Because of the nature of the program, I often worked in bad areas and a lot of Section 8 projects. We have a generator on the back of our truck that we use daily. The power supply in most of these rundown homes wasn't enough to support our tools. As you can imagine, the generator is pretty loud, and a lot of the time you'd hear it sputter and kick on and off. This usually meant some debris or dirt got into the fuel filter. No problem. Clean it out and start it back up again. One morning, we fire up the generator and get it to work. While I'm 12 feet up on a ladder installing a bathroom fan vent, I hear the generator start to slowly quiet down. I roll my eyes because I know I'll have to get down, go out front to the truck and clean the filter. But since at that particular moment I wasn't using a tool, just a caulk gun, I figured, who cares, I'll do it when I'm done here. But then the generator makes a fainter noise and gets fainter and fainter, and I knew something was up. I get down from the ladder and go out front. About 5 houses away on the sidewalk are 2 gentlemen trying their best to run away with our generator while it was still on. The thing weighs about 300 pounds and it is awkward to carry, even with 2 people. The strain and back crippling run they were doing was impressive. I really couldn't even be mad. I just caught up with them, tried to stop them. One guy had a screwdriver he was threatening me with. I backed off and called the cops. They caught up with them a block later. They weren't hard to find. They ended up getting charged with robbery and both went to the hospital. They both had severe burns on their arms and legs from the exhaust on the machine running up against them as they made their great escape. From there on out, the machine was chained to the truck. Story 3. For once, I actually have a story to comment. So the one thing that stays with me from home happened on Christmas Day evening when I was 8, when a woman we'd never seen before knocked on our door and told us there was a figure outside our house. Now, I live in a rough area, but any termination normally happens on the other side of my estate. But this time, someone had been ended about 6 feet away from our front door, just outside the front garden and hidden by the garden wall. It was dark and it was covered by his raincoat and the shopping bags he'd been carrying. So nobody had noticed it. It was Christmas Day. Everyone was inside with their families. The woman who found him only noticed because she'd nearly run him over with her car. I lived near a school, so they checked the security cameras and eventually figured out that he'd actually been attacked about 500 yards away and had walked all that way before collapsing outside of my house. It was quite an experience for me as there were police everywhere, TV crews, search dogs. We weren't allowed to leave the house for a week in case we disturbed evidence. If we did go out, we had to sign in and sign out with a liaison officer at the end of the street. Now, as an 8-year-old, I couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. I just knew that someone was ended and it wasn't an accident. Eventually, they found the weapon in a neighbor's garden and found the criminal from the prints. He was a local gang leader who'd ended his best friend because he'd been having an affair with his girlfriend. They'd argued as they were on their way home from the corner shop and the guy had just attacked his friend and then ran off. The victim was in so much shock, he'd kept walking until he finally ended. I never did find out who he was because I can't remember the specifics, but that Christmas will always stick with me. Story 4. My mother used to manage and live in a motel in a really rough neighborhood. She got cancer and became too sick to work anymore, but didn't want to move away from her home, so I came back from college to take care of her until she passed, which also entailed managing the motel. The motel also served as a long-term apartment solution for many people, and we had people who lived there perpetually for months or even years. In my time as manager, there was a double termination and 2 attempted ones, in contrast to her time there, in which there was a single termination and 3 attempted ones. She was there much longer, however. This was all in addition to many other similar events, lots of various charges, lots of property damage, etc., from the tenants that lived there, not to mention just lots of general unruliness. I was on a first-name basis with most of the regular cops. Now, one of the most glaring things that stayed with me from there was just the intensity with which people lie. I mean, everyone knows people lie a ton, but every single day, someone would just come up with the stupidest, most implausible lies and expect me to believe them. You don't have your rent for this week because your boss randomly decided not to pay you? Bro, I can literally smell your room from the service hallway through the bathroom vent. That isn't a plastic bag you're burning in there, it's substances. Of course, calling every single person out on their lies constantly is a fantastic way to get terminated, so I'd often give them a day or two and then tell them the owner told me to give them the boot, and just let the cops handle it if they objected. Even being personable, I unavoidably made some enemies that I would rather not have simply due to the nature of the job. Sorry, can't rent to you, ma'am, you're on the blacklist. Why in the world? Because we found some things in the room, because you literally threw your needles away in the bathroom garbage without even putting a bag in it first. Oh yeah, I saw those when I was there, was going to tell you about that. They were there when I rented the room, wasn't me. I have hundreds of stories from that awful place. I could write a book, but I'm glad I'm out now though. Story 5. I grew up with drive-by terminations and gang activity in general. I feel like a lot of important childhood memories are interlaced with weird neighborhood stuff. The day we got our first puppy, my friend across the street pulled a weapon on his dad. When the cops showed up, he ran down the street and turned the weapon on himself. Everyone was fine that day, but I'll never forget having a new puppy and not being able to take it to the bathroom because we could get terminated. I also learned to treat everyone with respect. People looked out for us. In junior high, I was chased home often by men yelling that they'd pay me for my services. In high school, my family worked nights and I was home alone. At this point, my friend across the street just got out of prison and was mad I was home alone. He called in a favor with the and they patrolled my street at night. My mom said oftentimes she'd come home just as 2 motorists would drive away. They protected me for a few years. Wow, having the patrol your street at night? Now that's some serious backup, man. It's like having your own biker guardian angels. Story 6. I was a quote-unquote punk rock girl, just really poor actually, and I befriended almost everyone including the area homeless and the gangsters. I did a lot of substances with a lot of different people to gain their trust and loyalty. Eventually, I smoked enough, drank with enough people, and fought enough girls that I wasn't an outsider anymore and I got a name for myself. Me and my older brother were pretty well known throughout the city, and it changed from being scared of the area to being scared of the area enemies. My friends were getting locked up on the regular, but it was easier to live the gang life than it was to be a functioning member of society. People would rather make substance money because it's a world they know, it's all that they know. Poverty is a cycle, and I've seen firsthand how it keeps everyone where they're at. It was incredibly hard for me and my family, just me, my mom and brother, to get out of the ghetto. The system treats you like you're all criminals and that we're all choosing to live like this. Me and my brother started working awful under-the-table jobs to help our mom out, and eventually we moved to a nicer part of town but still in the same awful city, and we slowly grew out of poverty ways. It's all a distant memory now. We've all parted ways and we're all in different stages in our lives, but I still have the scars that serve as a reminder that I can't forget where I came from. Everything is a luxury, a flushing toilet, a washer and dryer, clothes with no holes, and food that's actually fresh, not microwaved or top ramen. The days of survival are over, but sometimes I look back and nostalgia tricks me into thinking they were better times. I can't romanticize it, it was terrible, and my mom was constantly crying about not being able to provide us better lives. The poor community needs real assistance, real education, and a government that actually cares about its people. Without it, people will continue the way they do to live another day. Using substances to escape, using violence to control, and selling substances to make money off of its own destruction. Story 7. I lived in Hackney, East London in the 90s. It was pretty bad. One night I was walking home and there was a guy just lying in the middle of the street. He looked departed. People were walking past him, and what's worse was that he was lying right outside a busy, well-lit taxi office, and the staff weren't doing anything. My friend and I stopped and checked him out. He was young, black lad. When we touched his shoulder, he murmured something and my friend said, "It's okay, we're helping you." We looked for injuries but saw none. Then I said, "He's very tidy. I don't think he's a user." My friend, stupidly, put his hand in the guy's pocket, pulled out a diabetic alert thing, and we also saw he had a hearing aid. Poor man. Poor man had a diabetic episode and passed out. We called an ambulance and had very strong words with the staff in the taxi office who just looked at us like we were the dumb ones. Also, one day I saw an old man arguing with a young man outside my flat. The young man was pleading with the old one, "Please, uncle, please." Thought no more about it until 2 days later. The lift kept going past my floor, the 17th floor, and stopped on the 19th. When the lift doors opened, I saw the door to one of the flats on that floor was always open. Turned out it was Uncle's flat. The young man had ended him shortly after that argument because Uncle wouldn't lend him money. Uncle was a local moneylender and he was terminated for his cash. Yikes. In Hackney, even the streets are dramatic, huh? Story 8. I'm white and grew up on a couple of rough council estates in England, which for most of my life I ignorantly thought somehow excluded me from having grown up in the hood. Now that I'm older and have lived in another hood in the US for the last few years, though I know that's BS, it's all the same problems. The only difference is here in the US, the hoods are predominantly black, whereas the two neighborhoods I grew up in only had two black people. A lot of us were of Irish descent, though. I couldn't say what it's like for the average decent person, which is honestly most everyone in an area like that, since I was one of the kids who grew up in a pretty awful family that helped makes the hood what it is. My dad was a construction worker, bouncer, and criminal. The criminal schemes I know he had going on when I was a kid were dealing, which made my mom and older brother do for the most part since he was never home. Insurance fraud, usually agreeing with people to steal and trash or burn their cars. And burglary, which he also used my brothers for. Thankfully, I'm the youngest brother and came along once he settled down a bit, but he was still a schmuck. My brother's criminal leanings helped me quite a bit, though, since almost every major crook in our area ended up being a friend of the family somehow and respected my brothers. I didn't really have any issues in regards to safety because of that. Later on, when we moved to a new estate, I found that people would pick fights on me a lot more because I was nervous looking and small. I'd keep my head down with my hands in my pockets a lot, and fully grown at 23 now, I'm still only 5'6". I eventually figured out to start acting like my dad, though, who's barely taller than me but doesn't seem to fear anyone or anything. I'd walk confidently and either completely ghost people by just staring up and passing them if I sensed they might be the kind to try to start something. I don't really know why most people get uneasy when someone physically small acts like they could mess them up, even if at the time I knew almost certainly I couldn't. As for experiences that have stayed with me, it's primarily just the horrible things that come with being poor. My mom has always had depression and anxiety. And my dad, combined with how me and my brothers were for quite a while, plus taking care of my severely disabled younger sister, and financial stuff turned her pretty crazy. She'd cry a whole lot and I'd try to help, but eventually her depression seeped into me too and I became a bit of a shell for a while. It didn't help that her issues made her pretty demanding and psycho towards me. Some sort of parentification at a time where I was very immature and mentally fragile, I think. My worst memories are inside my home, just of my mom's breakdowns and my dad going on his rages, smashing everything and threatening. Not that bad as trauma goes compared to a lot of others. One outside memory that does stick with me, though, was when one of the local gang angered off a couple of the others somehow. I think I was told the reason, but I don't remember it. They'd had a bit of a fight and the dude they didn't like anymore had ended up on the ground. The main dude in the gang kept telling him to get up, but every time he did, he'd boot him again. There were about 20 kids watching, and I felt awful for the dude despite knowing he was a schmuck. That guy did get my brother into carjacking, though, one of the things my dad didn't teach him, and majorly contributed to all his arrests that eventually got him put into foster care in juvie. So enjoy this time in prison, dude. Story 9. I think the biggest challenge is growing up and knowing the people creating that kind of violence. I forget how it came up, but in the 7th grade, I remember this kid just brought up that he slept on his living room couch with a bat, because he was afraid rival gangs were going to mess with his family. Like just talking openly about it in front of the whole class and teacher. And looking back on it, he must have been really scared to bring it up like that out of nowhere. By the end of the year, he was arrested for weapon charges. Guess he felt the bat wasn't enough. This other kid sat next to me in the 6th grade. He was smart, but obviously in a gang. Never came to school. Saw him a few years later and he was paralyzed. Couldn't really talk or walk straight anymore after a bad car accident. And there was this other kid in the 2nd grade who was really sweet and super funny. Now he's in music videos trying to be the next trap rapper, waving around weapons and stuff. Still sweet and still funny when we bump into each other. Then I started working in the hood at a high school, and I remember this kid talking about wanting to get out, but he couldn't. He just stopped going to school altogether. Ran into him at a Target a few years later, and he was able to get out of it and get his GED. Super proud of him. This other kid wanted to get out too, but he already had weapon charges and had been to juvie. We talked about getting his record expunged as a minor. He seemed real interested, but never followed through. That kid was smart too. Story 10. I grew up all over Chicago, but about once or twice a week we had to get dressed on the floors for school in the morning because there was something going on outside. Often people would try to stop you while you were walking and say, "Give me all your money," to which I would respond, "I'm broke too," without slowing down. Never had to go further than that. Rent was insanely high compared to working pay rates, so I had to get a job when I was around 12 to help pay bills. Also, I frequently stole food from the local grocery store to help feed my siblings while my mom and stepdad worked. That soon led to me stealing drinks and selling it for money for food. My high school also had a police office inside of it. Every day after school, there would be paddy wagons and SWAT vehicles with officers strategically positioned around the school to keep the violence down. Bars on all lower floor apartments were a big safety thing I never thought of until I moved to Wisconsin, where there are no bars on the windows. I spent the first 5 to 6 months at night sitting on the couch till sunrise watching the bay windows in the living room because I was afraid people were going to break in. It still bugs me sometimes. I'm not a person who seeks out violence, but I am always on edge waiting for it to happen now. I don't like crowds, and when I'm walking somewhere and anyone is walking towards me, I have my hands in my pocket clenched or hands on my weapon just in case. I always sit in public like at a restaurant or movie theater near the exit and with my back to the wall when possible. The most difficult thing is when I'm talking to people, I have to focus on making eye contact, especially when we are talking outside. Because when you are talking outside in a city like Chicago, you have to keep your eyes out for suspicious behaviors, like a slow-moving car or people doing double takes. You got to keep your head on a swivel, and people out here think you are tired of listening to them and have places to be when I'm actually fully engaged in the conversation. I just need to make sure I can see my surroundings, just in case. Story 11. A couple of years ago, I was leaving my house for uni when I heard a huge bashing sound coming from my neighbor's house, who I didn't know well but had always seen around and chatted to occasionally. I live with my bro and it was a rough neighborhood but lots of break-ins and fights, so I always try to keep my head down and be polite. Anyway, I had a look and saw a guy, who later turned out to be a plain-clothed policeman, breaking into the house. Police then swarmed the house and removed about 4 women who looked like they had been mistreated, a whole bunch of dudes, and a ton of substances and weapons. Turns out they were running an illegal house and had been monitored by police for months. I knew something dodgy was going on because guys would come and go in the middle of the night and could always smell grass, but I had no idea it was that serious. Turns out they were keeping the women hooked on substances and threatened them if they ever left the house. Scary stuff. I was always polite to them and kept my head down whenever possible. This was in the UK, but I guess the same thing would work anywhere else. And if you're enjoying the video, wherever you are around the world, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 12. I was born in a rural area and have lived in the city most of my adult life. I work in some of the roughest neighborhoods of one of the roughest cities in the world, and knock on wood, no one has ever given me any trouble so far. However, when my very rural family members come to visit me or when we travel together, they seem to be sitting ducks for ghetto drama. For example, I was annoyed with my sister when she traveled to the city I live in and she held her gigantic iPad up in the air taking photos downtown while surrounded by the worst kinds of people. Example 2, I had to lecture my sister when we traveled to Miami together, and she was walking around a terrible neighborhood holding up a $20 bill that she was going to pay for gas with. She literally was like holding it up in the air and swinging it around for some dumb reason. I was listening to a guy recently talk about how having kids made him realize how much danger there is constantly surrounding him. Like, not danger to him, but danger for his wife and kids. Replace kids with rural adult family members, and you have my experience. Story 13. Grew up in a rough area of North Las Vegas. One of our apartment neighbors was this guy that ran with a Mexican gang and sold substances. One day, my brother and I are playing in front of our door when we see about 3 biker dudes roll up. They knock on the door and politely ask our neighbor's wife if her husband was home. She says yes, and he comes to the door. Within seconds, they took him from his doorstep and proceeded to roughen him up with weapons they pulled out of seemingly nowhere. He's screaming, pleading for help, wherein steps in neighbor number 2. He screams down and says he's coming, at which time the bikers proceed to run out towards the parking lot. They haven't reached the lot when suddenly, boom, 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 glass shatters and you can hear projectiles hitting steel. Neighbor number 2 legit tried to end these dudes in front of us. By now, my mom is screaming, rounding us up to come inside. We go upstairs to write out the police questioning that will follow. The cops show up and knock, but my mom refuses to open the door. We never talked to the police, and that is how you survived in those places. If it doesn't involve you, you saw nothing. And even if it did, you still didn't see anything. Very memorable part of my childhood. Story 14. I'm from Miami, specifically Miami Gardens, North Miami Beach, which has a ridiculously high crime rate. I didn't have a social life from elementary to most of high school because my parents made me stay inside. There were a few things that stuck with me. The world is pretty quiet. In my hometown, there were sirens and helicopters nearly 24/7. When we finally moved away, it was something of a shock at how quiet everything was. It honestly felt like I was on a vacation for so many months after we moved. The smell of grass makes my stomach turn to this day. It was always in the air, and my parents just told me that it was goat cooking. They didn't tell me the truth till after we had moved. A very distinct memory I have of Miami is one day my dad was driving me to school. As we turned a corner only a couple of blocks away from our house, we came upon yellow police tape. Laying in the middle of the street was a haphazardly covered figure. That image always comes to mind whenever Miami comes up. Story 15. I grew up in probably the second worst part of our city, but being the wrong color made me stand out, so I learned to be smart. I kept my head down like a lot of these other commenters said. Get off the bus, power walk home, play video games. One day I hear what sounds like fireworks, so I turn down the computer speakers. It's pew pew pew, lots and lots of pew pews. I don't remember the whole story, but some were holed up in their house exchanging projectiles with some gangs outside with fully automatic weapons on each side. A stray projectile hit an innocent person a few houses down. I haven't thought about this in years, but I'm sure her kids have had a hard life since then, sending good vibes their way. You can keep your head down all you want, but there are terrible people in these places that do not understand how their actions can affect the world around them. If anybody reads this and thinks they're stuck in that type of situation for life, you're not. I got out and I'm doing just fine. Start reading. The library is free. You don't need a plan, just strive to be better. Story 16. I had a few things happen that stick out. I will give a few examples. I got a few stories and can't sleep, so this might as well be a novel. The house next to me growing up, I literally could open a window and touch it, was a shady house. Cars would pull up at all hours of the night, 10 p.m., 1 a.m., 4 a.m., hell, even when we left for school, beeping their horn, conspicuous as hell. This was early aughts before everyone had a cell phone, and someone would run out and serve them, or a woman would get in the car with them. Every time they beeped their horns, the dog across the street would start barking, creating a chain reaction of the neighborhood dogs barking. It was like the hood's equivalent to a blue light special alarm going off. We got deals. 3 things happened that stick out to me from that house. I'm about 15 and it's 2 a.m. My bedroom is the very first room of the house with 2 windows overlooking the porch. I just lay down one night when I hear the fence rattle in the other house next to me. I get hypervigilant and start staring at the windows. Through the slits of the blinds without any other noise, the streetlights shining through were suddenly blocked. Cue the uh-oh moment. 15-year-old me is about to save the day. I quietly get out of bed and grab my baseball bat. I'm just inside the doorway to my room that led to the entryway. I quickly hit the lights and run into the hallway with the bat. At the top of the stairs, like the good dog he was, a 100-pound German Shepherd was already ready. Soon as the light came on, he started barking like I never heard him bark before and began charging down the stairs the same time I'm coming out of the room. Bat in hand, I look towards the front door, which is made up of 9 different panes of glass, and I see this hooded figure leap off the porch and run into the night. My heart was racing. I didn't tell my parents either because I knew it would stress them out. That one was a rather mundane encounter. The second thing that happened involving that house upped the ante a little bit. It's sometime around dusk and my family is eating dinner at the kitchen table. It's not even fully dark yet, when out of nowhere an insane amount of pew pew pews go off in the alley behind our house, and then you hear return fire coming from the other direction. It wasn't until a projectile came through the back wall into the kitchen where the whole family was that my dad leaped out of his chair and tackled my mom and my brother onto the floor, and despite having cancer, grabbed his weapon and went outside. Luckily, it was over and done with. I eventually went into the alley with him where neighbors were already coming out, and I remember seeing shells all over the alley. The police, well, they never came. The final event with this house, I'm hanging out on my porch when this unassuming 4-door pickup rolls up super fast. In an instant, all 4 doors swing open while police are coming up the block from every direction. It's a goddamn raid, and I get front row seats. They run into this house, weapons drawn, there's all sorts of commotion, and within 5 minutes, they're dragging people out there in cuffs, and I'm just shooting away on my camera. The next day, the landlord cleans the place out, and I kid you not, a shattered bathtub was put out for trash collection. Also, there was a captive situation where this guy held 2 people in a house captive. They shut down the whole neighborhood. I actually got put into cuffs that day, and he ended them and himself. That was a crime I witnessed from afar. I saw the muzzle flashes. I skipped school one time, and on the way home, there was this high-speed chase, and the guy almost crashed into me. I had to pull over because I was so shook. Then I got a lecture later that day for skipping school because my mom saw an aerial view of our car on the news. I've had middle school friends that were hit by stray projectiles, high school football players that were ended. When I was 10, there was this dude everybody called Chicken Wing. Don't ask, I don't know. Who was ended by this dude named Paco. Everybody knew he did it. Police couldn't prove it. This isn't even mentioning all the fights I had to be in or the times I've been jumped walking home. Unfortunately, my parents still live there. Story 17. Day-to-day really isn't terrible. I consider day-to-day to be better than living in rich areas. And you certainly have more of an opportunity to make a difference here. I moved to my city when I was still married, a few years removed as teenage parents when we came from VA to MA for a job. We really didn't have many options where we could afford to live. After my son's mom left, my son and I had even fewer options. Even though I was a previously suburban white guy, people did seem to respect that I was trying to do the best for my son and were good to us. I bought a seriously run-down house in one of the worst neighborhoods so my son's babysitter could live upstairs, and over 10 years, I fixed it up room by room while he was asleep. Some of the things that happened to me in that time? A person was arrested across the street for roughing up his mate into a coma for leaving his gang. A lab was busted a few doors down, and the police blew up a homemade bomb in the street that the man running it used to threaten his roommates in case they called the police. A random white guy was ended by walking down the street at 2 a.m. as a way for men to enter a gang. By the time my son was approaching high school age, I knew he was being limited by the schools. Even though the teachers tried hard, the high school had a 66% graduation rate. And if you were a teacher with a limited number of minutes a day, would you put your time into the failing students or my son who was going to graduate anyway? By the time he was in the 8th grade, I had a down payment for another house. But in 2008, I couldn't sell my first house. There were 3 foreclosures on my street alone. Through begging, luck, and putting every penny I had together, I managed to get a small house at the edge of one of the richest towns in the state, country even. I rented my old house out and it helped, but if I'd lost my job, I'd have lost everything in a month or two. But I got my son into their high school. Problems I faced there? The police stopped and checked me out while I drank in my own yard the first day I mowed the lawn. Everything was so expensive. It would have cost $1,000 for the bus pass for school, so my son rode his bike and walked in the winter. Everybody worried about who was better than who, and everybody thought they were better than me, even though I doubt many could have ended up in that town if they had started off with zero. After my son graduated and went to college, I moved back to the city. I drank a lot, honestly, as I really didn't know what to do with myself anymore. But if there was one place people wouldn't judge me for it, this was it. But the problems still haven't changed, some of them. One of my former tenants was ended at a house party, which he really didn't go to anymore, but made an exception when visiting cousins wanted to go out. Another former tenant was terminated when 2 men entered his apartment and waited for him. They jumped him, then left him to fade away after stealing his stuff. This happened last July, and I can see the window where they entered from my laundry room window. My next-door neighbor's son passed away 2 summers ago. I called in while playing Pokemon Go last summer and now carry medicines around. These are troubles that I can't stay out of, however, and one good thing about this place is that I can make a difference just by being a good person and a positive example. The place certainly isn't going to get better if all the good people leave and the enlightened rich people talk about it from far away. Today, I'm going to teach AP Physics at the high school where my son should have gone before. The graduation rate is better now, almost 80%, I believe. The kids share a book between them in class, and it's the 1998 edition. In the rich town where my son went to high school, every kid got 2 books, one to keep at school and one to keep at home. But the biggest challenge these kids face is just lowered expectations. In the rich town, everyone thought they were special and everyone went to college. Here, nobody thinks they're special, and going to college to get a white-collar job is talked about in the same reality as working hard to become the president. Hopefully, I can change that, as taking school seriously is how I managed to make something of life for my son and for myself. Story 18. My first year living in Japan, the school put me in the apartment building they owned, which was in the middle of a neighborhood. I think the school bought that building for their teacher housing because it was super cheap since no one else really wanted to live in that neighborhood, and the school assumed that the foreigners just wouldn't notice what was going on and that nearly every building around them was a business hotel. One of the other teachers was married to a Japanese man who told us what to look out for and how to act if we ever came across a large group of black cars, men wearing a certain style of suit, especially if they were guarding the entrance to a spa, or if the police blocked off a street and showed up in SWAT gear, all of which happened from time to time. In general, it wasn't bad and people left the foreigners alone. After living in that neighborhood for a while and leaving for work with another teacher I was friends with every day, the women who worked in the hotel started to recognize us, and they would say good morning to us as we passed them on the streets. But one morning, the other teacher was sick, and I went to work on my own on my bicycle. And on my way home, two of the women who worked at one of the bigger hotels came outside when they saw me, stopped at a stoplight next to their building. They were very concerned, and between their bits of English and my bits of Japanese, they were able to ask me where my friend was, and I was able to communicate that she was sick but would be back at work in a day or two. Story 19. I lived in a shadier part of the Philippines, so I'm not sure if this one counts. My house has all its windows barred with steel grates. Our wooden door has a metal door cover. Our garage is practically a padlock cage. We do have a yard, but it's enclosed in 6-foot-high walls topped with barbed wire. Worth noting that even with all of these, we've had our house broken into already. That one time we were out of town for a week. I've been pickpocketed so many times, but since I didn't really have a lot with me, I've only lost a mobile phone once. And at one point, somebody tried to rob me, but there was a patrol nearby, so I got lucky. I drive my car, so it's not as often for me, but I have friends who seem like they're getting robbed on a yearly basis. There was a time a lot of cops showed up, like SWAT and all. Turns out an apartment from across the street was a holding area for victims, and was currently holding a really rich guy's daughter. Since the place itself was relatively quiet, we never really knew until the cops stormed in. A few blocks away is a slum area. The whole Duterte administration war on substances is more akin to war on poverty, since most of the police ops is done there. Figures turn up regularly during the raids, with the cops claiming the quote-unquote dealers fought off the cops, but we all know better. These dealers are usually too poor to even have weapons, and even if they did, no one in their right minds would try to fight off a police raid and expect to come out alive. Best part is that all of this is so routine now that I didn't even think of these details until this thread came up. Story 20. I lived in a pocket of Korean American immigrants in the middle of a rough Chicago neighborhood. One of the more gang-concentrated neighborhoods, lots of crime, police sirens just about nightly in the neighborhood. I could walk around by myself at any time of the night and be fine. This was true for the vast majority of us. Out of hundreds of Koreans, maybe only a handful of us were the victims of a crime over the course of decades. I later learned that this was because if an Asian was victimized, police would take the crime seriously. So the gangs avoided targeting the Asians if possible because police were a lot less likely to pursue or respond to a crime targeting any of the Black or Mexican people in the area. Now, I made friends with a lot of kids that would grow up to be in gangs as a result. Never had any trouble from them, but maybe that's because I didn't act afraid or treat them differently. One kid I knew since I was about 8, I learned was hooked on substances by his dad so that he would be into being a mule. They were both deported to Mexico, which probably took away any chance he had at a normal life. The local church was putting a lot of effort into helping him spend time away from gang life. I think a lot of prejudiced people have come from the fact that they don't encounter people portrayed negatively in ways that try to make that portrayal representative of a culture. They then choose to see these things like Black culture is corruptive and crime infested, instead of Chicago pushed the criminal elements into low-income neighborhoods so they could control the crime better. And a kid raised in those ghettos for 18 years is going to have some hurdles to get through. It has nothing to do with skin color, which sadly too many people fail to understand. Story 21. I'm a bit late on this one, but anyway, here goes. I grew up in what was eventually nicknamed the Australian Bronx back in the day. Crimes were rampant, and so much so not too many people would care about a person being coated till it started to smell. It was the one time I actually got to see a fire truck on fire. Most of the neighborhood kids were rocking cool fire jackets and helmets for months after that. Ambulances would not go near the area without police escort. Even then, it was iffy depending on who it was needing assistance. If it was a dealer that was harmed, as an example, then they would run off anyone there to help, including police at times. The ATF or SWAT was called more times than I can remember. So much so you got to learn their tactics. It was a scary place to live. I was a tiny guy but liked for the most part by most people, but it also made me a target. I learned to hustle and to fight well for a little guy. I also got known as a kid that carried a weapon. I never actually carried one, but I had jumped heading back home from a friend that just gave me the weapon this one time. I was one kid against 3 larger kids. I took a few good hits and went down really fast. It was when they stared at me on the ground that I had had enough and thought I'm not going out like this. I managed to get a hold of the ringleader's leg and pulled the weapon. I thought if I played crazy enough, I might be able to get away. Turns out I was the only person that brought a weapon to a fistfight that, combined with a crazy look in my eyes, scared the rest of them away. I left with a threat that I can't really remember verbatim, but it was something silly like, "Next time I see you, I'm gonna eat you." I never saw him again, but word had gone out that I was a little unhinged. That was good, and most people left me alone for the most part. About 12 years later, when I was passing by the area and stopped for petrol, gas, I was looking at chips to buy and this same guy tried to jump me in the store. Stupid choice on his part. He'd been 12 years on the bad side of substances. He was reluctantly kind enough to pay for my fuel that day. I have many other stories from that place and time. It did make me grow up fast, too. I learned street smarts, which helped me more often than not in my day-to-day life. I was a dumb kid that had to learn how to become a smart adult. I'm still trying to become the latter. And if you liked or connected with any of these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hanging with me on this one.